Okay, let's continue with our next fireside chat. I'm joined now by Jared Glover, Director of Procurement at Santander, and our topic is driving holistic value from the supply chain. So a warm welcome for Jared, please. Okay, where I'm going to start is with the title, holistic value. How does that fit in? What does that mean to you in terms of procurement when it comes to sustainability?
So, I think the important thing, the key point that I want to get across as part of this discussion is everyone in procurement has to have a focus on cost. That is the complete non-negotiable of the procurement role. So that is, if you want a job in procurement, you should be able to manage and engineer cost. But that's the baseline, and that's old money. Now, for anyone that we're interested in, certainly on my side, we look for people to understand true value. And true value for me is expressed not just in cost, but in the other levers that you can pull of value throughout your engagement with your supply chain, your engagement with your business. And that is sustainability. It is looking at your impact that you have in the communities you work in. So it's a different view for me. Cost is an absolute no-brainer. Everything else, the people that I'm interested in, that I want in my organisation.
That's a good way of looking at it. Let's look at some of the key drivers now and the main reasons Santander focuses on sustainability in its supply chain. What are those key drivers for you? I always find this fascinating in terms of how different procurement professionals approach this. So
Santander are absolutely committed to sustainability from the top down. One of the key drivers that Santander have is a commitment globally that we have to be net zero by 2050. Which is signed up to by our global chair. But then when you talk about that within a UK context, we really have three pillars that we talk about. So we talk about, yes, that environmental pillar, where the key thing that we talk about there is our target towards that net zero transition. For those of you who are deeply familiar with Scope 3, which I imagine is a lot of you within this audience, you'll probably know in financial services, Scope 3.15, which is your financed emissions, is key for me. Whereas some of you will have different Scope 3s that will appear as more of your drivers. The social part, where we talk about financial inclusion, making sure that people have the skills for the future. And part of those skills for the future are having the skills to understand sustainability, because that's going to be a growing industry for many of us. And then last but not least, the governance. And the governance for us is making sure that we deal with people that are linked into both that environmental and that social area. So when I talk about environmental, and I talk about Scope 3.15, we are fundamental to home ownership in the UK. So we're a massive mortgage lender. For those of you who own a house, I imagine many of you live in a house, but hopefully some of you also own the house. 55% of the UK housing stock is from a time from before there were energy efficiency targets for heat. So we see a huge pressure on our customer base to pay their bills when they live in those properties that don't have the ability to retain heat once it's purchased, which offsets against the need to gain that funding to actually invest back in putting those retrofitting things in to retain that heat to make sure your bills don't come. So it's a Venn that really impacts you as individuals, and I'm sure some of you know about that and have experienced that. I used to live in a house that was built in 1850. I can tell you when I lived in that house, my energy bills were far more than the house I live in currently, which was built in 2017. So we partner with our supply chain to look at opportunities for people in that home ecosystem to access funding, to make sure they can retrofit, and to look for opportunities to understand what the energy efficiency of their property is, regardless of when it was built or bought. Then when I talk about social, within procurement but across the organisation, we really want to focus on empowering people with those skills of the future and talking to those people about what sustainability means for them, but also how do they get skills to be included in the workforce? How do we make sure that we have justice and fairness for people in labour and employability? And that all flows down to what we issue out to our suppliers, which is our code of conduct, our standard that we expect people to meet, which tells them about those principles and practices.
Yeah, that aspect of housing stock, that's something I'd not considered. And for the record, I'm in an ex-RAF house, which not only had pretty poor energy performance, but if you wanted to put something in the wall, you needed a JCB and at least one very strong rugby team and a lot of patience. But then you'd just about get a picture hookup. Let's move on to supplier collaboration, as you were mentioning there, and about suppliers. How do you make sure your suppliers, with that code of conduct, share your sustainability goals? Because there's one thing of telling, there's another thing of collaborating. How do you see that?
So, small warning here. We'll start out with, one, I enjoy audience participation, and the second is I've only ever been scuba diving twice. Both of those things will become relevant during this answer. So, can I ask people who work in procurement to raise their hands? There will be some people here. Keep your hand in the air if up to 10% of your team work on supplier relationship management or supplier collaboration. Keep your hand in the air if up to 20% of your team work in SRM or supplier collaboration. Keep your hand in the air if up to 30% of your team work in SRM or supplier collaboration. Keep your hand, there's some people that got a lot of people in SRM here, surprisingly. Keep your hand in the air if you've got up to 40%, up to 50%. I really want to talk to these three people who have up to 50% at some point. Please see me after this. When you talk about the peak of human ingenuity and where people want to get to, people often talk about the space race and, the famous story about, the cleaner, what's he doing helping putting a man on the moon. People often look to the stars and they look to the skies and they say, look, there's a great unknown out there, we want to adventure, we want to explore out there. That, for me, is exactly the same as procurement, because if you're talking about the space race and exploring space and the great unknown, and David Attenborough is sat to your left, David Attenborough will tell you that we've only mapped 20% of the ocean's floor. So we spent all the money looking at the stars, we don't spend much of the money looking at the ocean. And that, for me, is the same as our supplier ecosystem. So most of you put your hands down around about 20%, which thankfully suits this analogy. If you hadn't, I'd still say that, just so you know. But all of your teams focus on looking at space, looking at what people are doing out there, and you spend a small portion of your team looking at that ocean floor, getting into the depths with your team, and working on bringing that supply chain with you. So there are a few tips that I can give you. Three things. I think in procurement, as I said at the start, to be at the front leading edge of procurement, you need to be both a deep sea diver and an astronaut. You need to know both sides of it. From my point of view, you have to spend time with that supply chain to communicate to them, to map them, to understand what that ocean floor looks like. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we do that. So the first step, this is where the scuba diving comes in, by the way. Has anyone in this room scuba dived? Yeah, lots of people. Very good. What's the first thing they teach you in scuba diving? Someone shout out the answer, and I'm hoping it's the same answer that I got taught. Does someone say how to swim? Like that as an answer, yeah. How to hold your breath? Don't hold your breath. The thing I got taught first, which isn't the same as everyone else, just to say I only went twice, was communication. So, does anyone know what that means in scuba diving? You're okay. Does anyone know what that means? Go up. How many times do you think you've been talking to a supplier and you've said, you're okay, and they think you mean go up? Sometimes, for sure. The other thing is, you need to segment your supply chain. You might segment your supply chain. For those of you who spend over 50% of your time on SRM, the three people over here, you'll have segmented your suppliers. You'll have spent time segmenting. Segmentation of your supply chain for SRM versus segmentation of your supply chain for ESG is subtly different. So you can't reuse your SRM totally for ESG. You need to map the ocean that you're already aware of, because if you go and put on your full scuba suit to go splashing around in the shallows, you will waste your time. And last but not least, take some time and think about the data that you take from these people. I think we had a conversation about it earlier. I think my colleague from NatWest, who I can see sat here, might have said this. But if you ask for data and you don't know what you're going to do with it, it's absolutely pointless. Taking that data just doesn't help you. Don't spend any time gathering something that you don't know what you're going to do with, because it irritates your supply chain and it's pointless for you.
I would say that is an elite level analogy, and I enjoyed every second of it. Thank you very much, Jared. Let's go on to measuring success. And if you've got an analogy to go with this one, I'm all for it. I'll just sit back and listen. How do you go about measuring that success of the sustainable practices you follow within procurement? Because measurement is something that's come up time and again today already.
Yeah, so I'm a project manager by education, but secretly, deep down in my heart, I hate project managers. And I'll tell you why. Project managers express their love by asking for hundreds and thousands of metrics, and that's the way they show that they love you. If you're running a project, you get asked for so many metrics that it gets to the point where you become unable to run a project. Let's not do that in sustainability. Let's measure what we want to do, and let's be ambitious about that information we want to measure, whilst also understanding that there are limits, and those limits are defined sometimes by geography, and sometimes by taxonomy, by the type of spend that you have. Because if you spend a lot of time measuring, if we use Scope 3, because everyone's talking about Scope 3 a lot today, in a country where energy security is an issue, you are highly unlikely to be able to influence the type of energy that someone buys. You might be able to impact the way that they produce or the way that they work, if you're an expert in that area. Sometimes you won't have that degree of expertise. The gentleman from shipping this morning, I think, gave a great example of process engineering to drive efficiency rather than looking at energy consumption and the way you purchase energy. And you've got to be humble enough to know that you don't know as much of some of your supply chain. You've got to be humble enough to know that you don't understand the geography as well as they do. Use that as a feedback loop. We're incredibly proud about some of the things we've done sustainability-wise. So we've impacted, we've got a target this year in procurement to impact 5,000 lives, just in procurement. And we know exactly how we're going to do that. We know the steps to achieve that. And the reason why we can set that as a measure is because we know what we want to do, we know how we're going to do it, we know how to measure it. But there are other aspects that I would find harder to impact. And because I'd find them harder to impact, there is no point in me gathering that information, because it would just be stale information sat on my shelf that annoys my supply chain and me.
I've got a whole pile of questions here. I know I'm not going to get anywhere near. So what I'm going to do is come to the audience now to see if there's any particular questions before I return to my my list. Is there anything from the room at this point that anyone wants to put to Jared? Oh, we have one in the centre and one at the back. I will go to that.
And if it's about scuba diving, we've established I'm done with scuba diving now, yep.
And it's also not about my high-risk leaping off the stage strategy to save 10 seconds.
Hi, so my question was about the value that you're talking about. So how do you balance environmental, social, human rights, and kind of make sure they don't conflict with each other, as sometimes we know that they do? How do you decide which to prioritise? When you're talking to procurement teams, how do you kind of get them on board with all of the aspects?
Great question. So what we focused on heavily this year, and the big step we're taking to try and improve where we are sustainability-wise, is communication of our goals and education of our team, but not just our team, the wider teams in the organisation. So a couple of years ago, I was going to try and make this ambiguous about who it was with, but it was with my current employer. We bought a service where we spent an incremental amount more money, and that incremental amount more money that we spent impacted the lives of some people in a positive way. It's fantastic. And a couple of years later, we came to the renewal of the tender to discover that the service manager, in their infinite wisdom during the contract life cycle, had said, I can save £20,000, and had taken that opportunity, because they just didn't have that degree of education to understand what our overall goals were as an organisation and the materiality of £20,000 versus those overall goals. So they made that trade-off that wasn't the right trade-off for us as an organisation. So we're focusing very heavily on educating not just the procurement team about our goals, but also educating into the business so everyone understands what sustainability means for us. And that for us is multiple measures, so exactly as you say. So we are fully committed globally to being net zero by 2050. We are fully committed locally to making sure that we ease the access for people into work, and we make sure people have greater financial education. We work on inclusion. And sometimes there are times when we have conflict between some of those. But the best thing that we can do is communicate that strategy, make sure everyone understands it, and then have an open and adult discussion when they come up, rather than kind of making those decisions without people being aware of them. Hopefully that answers that.
Thank you. And we've got one final question at the back here.
Hi there. Thank you very much, Jared. My name's Lorenzo. I'm the co-founder of a carbon nature-based solutions company. And we work with a lot of companies that, work on procurement and supply. One of the ones I loved most was Grosvenor. Now, they made publicly available their procurement policy. And they worked really closely with all their supply chain to get them on SBTI and to up-train them. I was wondering, when it comes to Santander, have you made your procurement process publicly available? And have you got any ways of helping your supply chain to upskill themselves or to come on the journey with you?
Yeah, so we don't make our full policy available to everyone, because within our full policy it basically says who has approval limits within certain things, and that really isn't for the public consumption. That's more kind of process-wise our side. But we do have a supplier-dedicated portal which launches actually off our sustainability website, and within that tells people what our policies and processes are, the way we want people to behave. We have an annual supplier day where we bring in our top 50 suppliers, and for context, in Santander, 200 suppliers represent 92% of our spend. So once we hit at that level, we're hitting at around about 80% of our spend. And at that meeting, so last year we had the head of sustainability. We talked about sustainability. We talked about cyber, because cyber is a big risk for financial services, but also for our suppliers. So we educate them as part of that. And we talked about all our strategic goals. So we bring them together and educate them about where we're going as an organisation, so that they feel aligned to it. But also we have that publicly available portal where they can access the kind of generic direction in less detail.
Okay, thank you for that last question. Well, there was so much more I wanted to get through. I've not got near it, but I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Gerald Glover, Director of Procurement at Santander.
Thank you.